Hi everybody, and welcome to the first lecture on game design theory. This is Zubek, and this is material for CS377, Game Development Studio at Northwestern University. So in the following three lectures, divided up over several videos, we're going to take a comprehensive look at game design theory, the theory of how do we analyze games, but also how do we start figuring out how to make games of our own. Because this is what this class is all about, making your own games from scratch to finish in a single quarter. And before we take the very first steps, let's think about how do people go about making games? How do people go about turning a concept into a design, right? Because we all have ideas about the games we would like to play. We all have ideas about the games we would like to make or mod or change. And there is that sort of question of like, how do we go from this idea of what I like to how do I make this into a reality? And just like in other disciplines, we have in the game design practice developed sort of like ways of thinking about games and ways of analyzing games that help us go from ideas into a design and then to a actual game. So the following lectures in these videos will follow basically the same format as my textbook, Element of Games Design, and we will go through the first basically 6 chapters in these videos. The videos are highlights, and definitely please read along as you watch these videos. So let's start from the beginning. We want to make a game about something. We all have ideas for what this game could be, but what do we do next? Do we just sit down and start writing code and starting doing stuff? Well, we could do that. I mean, that's not the worst thing that you could do, but it is helpful to step back a little bit and consider how it's going to work and what it's going to do, how it's going to make the player feel. So just like in other mediums, in writing, for example, it's useful to sit down and think about the plot before we start writing. Think about what the story is going to be, and also like consider who are we talking to and what are we saying to them, right? What is the point of our communication? And this is the kind of analysis we would like to do with games. Of course, we're not going to necessarily be talking about story, although we could. There are other elements of game design that we want to focus on. What are people going to be doing? Why are they going to be doing this? What is going to be the challenge and the reward of doing that? These are the kinds of things that we're going to be analyzing in this material. So at the core of a game idea, we can think of the sort of kernel of like, what is this game that we're going to be making? So in this class, we will be focusing on these elements of gameplay design. However, if we're going to make a larger game, maybe a commercially shipping game, there are additional concerns that we would have to worry about. Probably most importantly, we would have to worry about graphics, visual design. How is the game going to look and how is it going to compare to other games? We might want to consider characters and story. Is there going to be an actual storyline in there? Maybe characters that develop over time. We'd have to really worry about the technical design of it, making sure that everything is playing smoothly in the target hardware and so on. And these are kinds of different aspects of game design broadly construed that are important to think about when we're making a product that we're going to ship to players. And these are, unfortunately, all intermingled. Each element of these influences the other. If we make changes to characters, for example, they will impact everything else. If we introduce a new character, for example, we're making an RPG and we introduce a new dwarf character and we haven't had dwarves in the game design before, this means that visual design needs to change. Now we have to figure out what they look like, or where they come from. We have to look at technical design. If maybe they have new weapons that require a different physics or something like that, this will change gameplay. How does the existence of dwarves in the game impact everything else and impact the kind of interaction loops that we're going to design and the overall player experience? Any change we make in any of these areas pulls on the other ones and modifies them. It's a fairly interesting, intricate execution problem to get this going. And Also, if we were making a commercial game specifically, something that we want to sell and succeed in the marketplace, we have to worry about all sorts of commercial problems as well. We have to worry about player fit. Who are the people who would be playing this, and do they even want this? We would have to worry about studio fit. Do we have the right people to make this kind of a game? If we're making a multiplayer game, do we have people who know how to do that? If we're making a grand open world RPG, do we have enough people to create all the content? And also, finally, like, we would have to worry about market fit. Is there a market for this game? Is it big enough? If we're making a very difficult platformer, for example, are there enough players to buy enough copies of this game to make it work financially? And also, is there maybe too much competition? Maybe there are too many platformers out there. Maybe so anyway, we would have to worry about all these kinds of problems. But thankfully, in this class, we don't. In this class, we're not going to be worrying about the intermingling of all these different concerns, the market concerns, the variety of game design problems, and we're going to be focusing purely on gameplay design, which is, as we said, how do we think about player experience and how to turn it into mechanics, game pieces, rules, systems that are going to produce this kind of experience. So we're going to be looking at games and thinking about them analytically, right? What are the games out there, sort of the games that we know, games that we like? What are they doing and how are they doing it? What makes them enjoyable to us? What makes them challenging? What makes them draw us in? And we're going to look at it both in terms of the kind of like experience, the subjective experience of it, and also we're going to look at them structurally. Like, what is it about their composition that makes them work? So that's going to be the focus of these three lectures on game design theory. And one important thing that I'm going to be coming back to over and over and over again is that game design is really at its core an iterative process, right? We don't design a game and just put everything together in our head and make it work. Games do not spring out fully formed out of the heads of designers, right? Games are things that we arrive at iteratively, something that we put together, that we create a small version of and then iterate on, we improve on it, try to get feedback, try to figure out how it works, build it larger and larger. And also, the game design is something that we will come at from two different ends. On one end, we will be looking at player experience, so we'll be looking at, like, what is the fun of this game? How does that work? And it's an interesting kind of a problem because fun is the thing that we seek, right? Like, we want the player to have fun, but fun as such is not a it's not a precise word, right? We will realize very quickly that we want more precise words than fun. But that's our goal, right? This is what we kind of want to achieve. And at the same time, we also have to look at the exact opposite of things, which is, well, what are the actual pieces and rules that we're going to be making? What are the behaviors? What are the things in the game? How are they going to behave? What are they going to do? These look like very different kinds of questions, but they are interrelated, and we have to look at them at the same time and kind of try to solve both of these problems at the same time. So that's going to be our approach. We're going to be looking at game design on three different levels. The main level is the base level is going to be mechanics and systems. Those are very rules and game pieces kind of level of things. The next level is going to be gameplay, which is how do all these elements behave at runtime once we put them in front of players and players start playing them and doing things. And then what does this turn into in terms of experience? What kind of fun does this generate for the player? What kind of motivations does it satisfy? So in these lectures, we're going to start with chapters 1 and 2 of the textbook, and which is going to actually talk about player experience first. And then we're going to switch back to the other parts. So one of the main motifs that we're going to be coming back to in this class is that games are a kind of an experience that we as designers are creating for the player. And it's an interesting second level design problem, right? Because we're not creating a story for the player to be following along and sort of interpreting in their head. We're creating an experience for the player. And experiences are inherently interactive. Experiences are something that the player participates in and actually changes as they act in it. And this is a very tough problem, right? And it's on one hand, it's made difficult by the fact that the player can't interact with us in any way, right? Like, player can't ask us, well, what do I do now, or what does the story tell me, or whatever. In some games they can, right? In role-playing games where there's a DM, they can talk to the DM. But in computer games, for example, there is no way to talk to the designer. So the only way to get the experience is to interact with the game itself. So the game has to have provisions for instructing the player or changing the world or whatever. And vice versa. We as the designer can't talk to the player, right? We don't have any influence over them. We can't reach into their head and cause them to have fun. We have to create an artifact and create an environment in which they will do things that will bring them the kind of like experiences and feelings that we perhaps want them to have, or perhaps we're setting up a sandbox and letting them experience the agency of what it's like to be in that environment. But in either case, what we are faced with is that our ability to create this experience for the player is mediated by the game artifact itself. Whether the game artifact is a piece of code that the player will interact with, or maybe just a set of rules on a piece of paper and some chips and cards and so on. The game artifact is the thing that is going to let us communicate our idea for the experience with the player. So let's take a look at a more concrete example of how we could analyze this kind of game design on 3 levels. And we're going to use an example that everybody probably knows, which is poker. And as we said before, we can look at how poker works in different ways. We could start by looking at the player experience. How do people feel about poker? Why do people play it? And immediately we can start listing out a variety of different player motivations and the way that they enjoy playing poker with. So we can look at just, some people enjoy the fun of playing a card game and the challenge that this provides. Some people might be really motivated by winning, whether it's making money or maybe showing other people how skillful they are, or maybe the thrill of the unknown and sort of like betting large sums of money on a unpredictable outcome. Some people might be not motivated by that at all and just enjoy socializing and hanging out with their friends, and playing poker is just a conduit towards that. There's a variety of different player motivations, and everybody is different, right? We can't say that poker is a game that does just a single thing. On the other hand, we can look at analyzing a game like poker also very structurally, right? We can look at, well, what are the actual things that players are interacting with? What are the things in their hands? What are the rules for putting down chips and taking cards and putting down cards? What does this do? How does it work as a structure, as a set of rules and elements? And what are those elements? And then connecting those two is the idea of, all right, when players interact with these game elements, when they place bets and they draw cards and they call each other's bluffs and so on, how does this work? How does this produce the fun and the idea, the enjoyment of winning and the enjoyment of socializing? And the link that glues them together is the idea of player activities, right? When they interact with the rules and the cards and the money, what are they doing? They're betting, right? And betting produces certain kinds of experience. They might be bluffing, they might be reading other people's facial expressions, try to see what's going on. They might be risking their money. And these kinds of activities that happen by players interacting with game elements, pieces, and rules, these activities generate the experience that they have. That's going to be our model that we're going to be following through this. In the 376 class, which you took before this one, you probably read the MDA paper, Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics. And that is kind of what we're going to be building on. MDA is, in a certain sense, like a color theory for games, right? In the sense that it is a very broad theory of how a game design works. It's immediately useful, and it's a great starting point. It is not meant to be a huge sort of architectural plan for how to make a game. It's more of a starting point for here's how we can understand games. Now, if we go back to the elements of poker we just described, so on one hand, cards, money, and other kind of material elements. On the far other end, the player experience of enjoying it, the fun of winning or risking your money or socializing and so on. We can see how this might map to mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. That is the sort of MDA mapping of these actions. However, we're going to use a different vocabulary because when we go and talk to designers practicing in commercial products and so on, they don't actually consider this as dynamics and aesthetics, right? When you talk to designers, when they talk about aesthetics, they think about visual aesthetics. And when they look at things like winning and having fun, they will consider this as player experience. And similarly with dynamics, that is not part of the design vocabulary. People talk about gameplay, people talk about player experience, and the gameplay also is kind of talked about a little bit differently than in the MDA paper. So what we're going to do instead is switch to a terminology which is more consistent with the contemporary usage in design practice. And we're going to be talking about the three layers as mechanics on the material end, player experience on the very subjective end of everything that comes out of the game, and the layer in between them being the gameplay itself, which is what happens when players interact with the mechanics and how that produces the experience. So this is going to be our model that we're going to be following in this class, and what we're going to be discussing at great length. And as I mentioned before, if we're making a commercial product, this is not enough, right? We will need to also consider other elements of game design. We will need to consider story elements and characters and plots and so on. We would need to consider how the game is going to look, how the game is going to be implemented in code, etc., etc. These are all aspects of designing a game as a product. However, for our purposes, we're going to be concentrating on gameplay design, and specifically these kinds of elements. So given that our goal is to create an experience for the player, give them a world in which they can interact and have experience new modes of agency, this presents a very direct challenge. As we talked about before, our design process is going to be mediated through this artifact of the game. And what we mean specifically is that as designers, we have a goal of creating an experience for the player. We want them to experience this kind of the new world or challenges and so on, but we can't create this experience directly. We have to work through the mechanics. We can design rules of the game, we can design objects in the game, activities, but that's all we can do. We have no control over what the player will be doing once they pick up those pieces, once they pick up those rules and start interacting with them. So we have to set them up in such a way that when they do pick them up and interact with them, this will turn into gameplay, and that this gameplay will turn into a desirable experience. So it's a second-degree design challenge to create rule sets and worlds such that they will enable players to have trajectories through them that will hopefully end in a good place and desirable experience that we want to bring about. They don't have to, right? Because the player is free to do what they want within the constraints of the game. But we can definitely impact what they're going to do and set up the rules to guide them. And I will just point out that this is a very interesting design problem that is unique to our medium, right? Because if we compare it to something like literature or movies and so on, all of these media create a single trajectory through the world. And they show the reader or the viewer what happens as the world and all the characters move along this trajectory. And there is a little bit of interactivity in the player's mind in trying to figure out what are the maybe motivations of the different characters, what are the things that are being unsaid, and trying to interpret the situation. However, the reader and the viewer of a movie, they cannot change the trajectory of the world. That is preset. Games are different. In games, the player will actively change the trajectory of the world, and they will, as they replay, they might do it in different ways. Different games will give them different ways to manipulate the trajectory. And some games are very on rails, and they will very highly constrain what you can do. And in other games, like the more sandboxy and the more freeform they are, they will just open up the world to the player and let them pick trajectories and let them do all sorts of things. And this is a huge design problem. The more freedom we give the player, the less control we have over what kind of an experience they're going to have. But this is unique to our medium, and if you're interested in this kind of topic, I will highly recommend the book Games Agency as Art, which talks all about how games are a medium of agency and how that changes aesthetically from other media. But to bring all this together, what we're going to be talking about in the next lecture is the player experience. So we're basically going to start from the player experience end and kind of work backwards. So we'll talk about player motivations and what players get out of games, as it were. And then in the following lectures, we will talk about the other layers, which are mechanics and systems and gameplay. So that's that for this lecture. I'll see you in the next one.